I'm thrilled, delighted to be introducing our speaker, Dr. Lucy Woodall. So Lucy is a very old friend of mine. In fact, I was involved in her PhD supervision, and she has long been a part of our Project Seahorse team and a variety of our seahorse conservation initiatives. She, however, has branched out into many other avenues as well. So Lucy is an associate professor at the University of Oxford and the principal scientist at Nekton, where she leads their science and knowledge exchange programs. Lucy is a marine biologist who has a passionate delight in illuminating the importance of the aquatic world with people all around the world. Her work is focused very broadly on processes that drive biodiversity in the ocean, but she's interested in understanding the impacts of human activities on these ecosystems, and Lucy being Lucy, in finding solutions to really make certain that we all engage in improving the health of our ocean ecosystems. Lucy provides expert opinion on marine conservation and sustainable marine management in a great number of initiatives. She's involved in the high-level panel expert group for the UN on sustainable ocean economy. She's one of the leading lights in the IUCN's SSC Seahorse, Pipefish, and Sea Dragon Specialist Group and the DOSI Pollution and Debris Working Group, and has a very strong public presence as well. So seahorses live in the very shallow parts of the ocean, but Lucy is going to be telling us about deep sea initiatives at the moment that are really quite compelling. So Lucy, thanks so much for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. That was a lovely introduction. And yeah, it's my pleasure and joy to be with everyone today. It is evening for me, but it's during the day for you all. So yeah, looking forward to some interesting dialogues as we move through. Sorry, let me just reshare that. That's a better one. You want to see yourselves. Right, okay, so now I'm showing the right screen. So today I'm going to talk to you about a piece of work that has been developing over the last 10 or so years, which culminated in an expedition in 2019 in Seychelles. And I'm going to talk to you about the process. So I'm going to share a little bit about the amazing life we see on the seabed. It's like a little snippet. But this is more about the process of how we were co-creating science in this large ocean state of Seychelles. As Amanda's already said, I do work both at the University of Oxford and as principal scientist for Nekton. So firstly, let me introduce you to two more people. They couldn't be with us today because they're both based in Seychelles, and it's the middle of the night for them. On the left-hand side, you'll see the wonderful Sheena. And when I first met her, she had just finished her MSc in South Africa and was working for the Ministry of Agriculture, Climate Change and the Environment. She was my link into the ministry, and I now have the joy of calling her a regular colleague because she is our science program manager at Nekton. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the wonderful Stephanie Marie, and she works for Seychelles Fisheries Authority. And when I first met her, she had only just been in the role a couple of months, and now she heads their fish larval program. So amazing to see two women scientists really coming through so much in the last few years. I next want to ask if you'll indulge me a little bit by me thanking lots of people at the beginning of the presentation rather than at the end, because actually it's very important for you all to know that I've just given you a snippet of the people and the organizations that were involved. These logos and these faces represent over 40 partners and over 150 people who were really essential to the project. All the way from funders to industry who provided in-kind support, and of course to the wonderful knowledge bringers who are resident in Seychelles. And on to the plan for this talk. As I said before, I'm not going to share all of the findings because that would be actually days worth of me talking, and I'm sure after 45 minutes you're going to be pretty much done. But it will give a little snippet of our science. So Of course, co-creating science isn't new, but it is pretty unusual in the deep sea science world, where equipment and platforms cost a huge amount. And of course, there's also a large amount of size. So this has meant that accessing the deep sea has been exclusive. And I want to provide some numbers because they're pretty stark. So for example, about 70% of coastal nations have deep sea in their EEZs, but only 17% have the capacity to explore their own waters at these depths. And that is a pretty hard-hitting statistic, and it shows how exclusive this environment is. So me just sitting here, being able to talk to you about this today, I have to recognize that amazing privilege. So I continue to learn from people like yourselves, and I do really mean that, across multiple disciplines and across multiple locations and institutes to really find better ways of working so that we collectively can steward the ocean in a better manner. So I guess our next player is the Seychelles itself, and Seychelles is a large ocean state. It is in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is the least explored and the least protected ocean. And you have to remember that's within the context of the coastal population of more than 2 billion and their high reliance on this ocean. There is a high habitat heterogeneity and also diversity in these waters. And of course, as a large ocean state, Seychelles is over 99% ocean. And you can really see that all the way from the inner islands on the top right, and the Mahe Plateau, where about 95% of the population live, all the way to the outer island groups of the Amarantes and Alphons that are more of the fishing communities, through to Aldabra. And some of you might know Aldabra because it is a World Heritage Site. And we'll come back to that later. So now I'm just going to give you a brief joy of what it is like in Seychelles. So this drone footage is kindly provided by Dilys Pomponu, and she took this video from Silhouette, which is an island just off Mahe, and we're looking back towards Mahe in the distance. These islands are granitic islands, so they do rise out of the sea quite a long way, and there's these beautiful lush forests. In fact, Silhouette that we're looking at on the right, those forests have the most richly endemic tree species in the whole of Seychelles. The islands that we'll be exploring in this presentation are the outer islands, and of course they only come 2 to 3 meters above the seafloor, so look a little different, but I thought it was quite fun to show you some of these other today. Seychelles has been an amazing place for marine science. I've just given 3 logos here of 3 organizations, but there's one thing apart from marine life that is rich in Seychelles, and that is the number of NGOs working on marine issues. So it makes a bit of a minefield for those of us who are sort of stepping into it, but it's a really good way of remembering that there is a lot of different views that everyone can bring. So the Seychelles Island Foundation, they do lots of marine monitoring, especially starting in 2013 as part of the UNDP project, and then continuing under the Outer Islands project for the surveying of Aldabra, which we've just spoken about, using scuba-based techniques, so the top 30 meters, and then a little bit of remote video work sporadically in a few deeper locations. We also have the Marine Conservation Society of Seychelles. They've been doing work since 1997, so quite a long time. But as their logo suggests, they've got a huge focus on long-term monitoring of whale, shark, and turtle programs. And then on to Nature Seychelles, and they have a bit of a restorative role, doing some coral restoration and also some protective management, but mostly around the Mahe Plateau. So this gives you the rich architecture really of the management and interest about the marine environment in Seychelles. So the other really important thing to know about Seychelles is that in 2012, they committed 30% of their ocean for marine protection. And this led to 2014 starting a comprehensive marine spatial plan, and this was facilitated by TNC under the guidance of the Environment Ministry. In 2016, something that facilitated this was the completion of the very first marine depth and nature swap, obviously again brokered by TNC, a seminal point in marine conservation and protection. So now the situation is, well, I say now, 2020, time has moved on. But after extensive multi-sectoral consultation, the final areas which you can see in front of you, those two green colours, were then gazetted, and that makes up just more than 30% of the ocean. And then that went through Parliament and Cabinet in 2020 in March. So they're currently now working on the implementation of management plans. And just for clarity here, the pale green colours are those areas that are zone 2. So they are mostly protected, but there are a few activities that are possible. And then this larger Aldabra group area is highly protected, with only subsistence fishing for the Aldabra research group actually being allowed within this area. So as I said, I'm going to talk to you about the process of understanding deep sea science in this area. And our first steps across this long process, these started in 2018 with multiple in-country visits and of course remote communications. And my work started in Seychelles by invitation, which is an amazing privilege. The principal secretary for the Ministry of the Environment was at an international meeting. We got talking and he said, well, come on then, come to Seychelles. And I've shown you a little bit about what Seychelles looks like from drone footage, but I tell you, the people are also completely amazing. So with an invitation to go to Seychelles, of course, we couldn't say no. And also with that ocean commitment, we could see where the additional information from deep reefs would be incredibly important. So for me, really, as the principal scientist, this process started with firstly meeting the president, which was great. It was a lot. It was important to be able to do that in Seychelles because the president and previous governments had that commitment to protection. Then the next stage was really to talk to the representatives from NGOs and from agencies and from ministries to talk about the process of going to sea, to make sure we were all in the same place and set expectations for what we could do together, but also some of the things that are probably outside of our remit as well. We also looked at science objectives and then finally at locations. And you can see in the picture here, this is one of the planning workshops where we agreed the knowledge gaps, and that was particularly using the information that was gathered from the marine spatial planning process and the additional management needs that were highlighted by ministry. So we co-developed some overarching research questions, and the main fundamental question was really, how do biological communities change with depth and geography? I mean, really quite a simple question. But we did have some applied questions that worked alongside that. And these were, how were the communities related to the assumptions that were made during the marine spatial planning process? Because what was found during that MSP, that there was very little, in fact, no data below 30 meters that was collected through systematic surveys. So this ground truthing exercise was incredibly important because habitats were being inferred using physical and chemical parameters. And then building off that, really understanding where patterns of life have changed through to stresses that they are in presence of. And we were able to do this particularly because of the protection that's been afforded to Aldabra. Of course, this expedition wasn't just about research. It was very much based on making sure that at the end there was going to be usable knowledge products that were needed and identified by the users themselves. There was also a real need for inspirational communications, and I will share some of those activities of what we did with you later. And this was underpinned by knowledge exchange. And just so we all know what I mean here by knowledge exchange, it's what other people might refer to as capacity development. I strongly feel that knowledge exchange is a dialogue rather than capacity development being a one-way conversation, which is hence why we use the term knowledge exchange in this particular case. So we embarked on this project on behalf and with the government of Seychelles and 12 Seychelles partner organizations. And I'm going to leave Angelique Pompinou, who is the CEO of SECAT, the Seychelles Climate and Adaptation Trust, and Sheena, who I've already introduced you to. And they're going to tell you about one of the initiatives that this project and SECAT did together. And then Sheena is going to tell us about some of her thoughts. So let's see if I can get this video working.
SECAT is a conservation financing body, and we are currently managing the proceeds of two innovative financing sources. One is the Debt for Nature swap, two is the Seychelles Sovereign Blue Bond, and together with those two instruments we are able to manage $700,000 every year. With these proceeds we are able to fund projects linked to marine conservation, climate adaptation, and the blue economy. So one of the very interesting initiatives that we took was a creative collaboration with the Necton mission. And this is where we were able to bring our funds together to be able to fund 6 Seychelles participants and their research projects on the Necton mission.
We had quite a big group on board that were Seychelles. All the Seychelles-based scientists had a project on board, whether that was collecting zooplankton samples, which are little organisms that live in the top surface of the ocean, or whether that was looking at predator abundance throughout the Seychelles Islands. Other tasks involved collecting biological samples throughout our EEZ.
SECAT is a conservation finance.
Here we go. So as you heard from Angelique and Sheena, we undertook work together, and what they both highlight was the importance of making sure that our partnership continued on board the expedition. So of course we had limited berths, but we have multiple legs of the expedition, and different Seychelles scientists came on to support the overarching goals, but also to have leadership on autonomy in their own projects. I'm now going to play a video clip from the then Principal Secretary of the Ministry, Alain Camponou, who will talk a little bit more about the process. And he was actually filmed when he was on expedition with us. So being able to take a decision maker to sea was actually really illuminating for all concerned.
Us as the government, we facilitate the process, but behind us, there's a whole list of stakeholders that we work with on a day-to-day basis, on a weekly basis. For example, in environment, the Ministry responsible for environment, which I'm from, we work very closely with local scientists, with local NGOs, with other authorities working in conservation. So it is very important that they are involved in this, because there is always some amount of information and data and historical knowledge that goes into it. So it's very important we can't avoid that we have this involvement of local people, local expertise and stakeholders, because in the end what we want also is to build that local capacity and an awareness on all these issues.
Wonderful, and really powerful words there by Alain de Comamo. So this was our final plan, and the blue arrows on the map here will show you where we went to. We went to the Amarantes group, and Alphonse. We plan to go to Farquhar, and of course I've already spoken around Aldabra. We were asked to go and look at these places because with a vessel we were able to get out to the remote sites, and this is where information was most patchy. And then what we needed to do was sit down. We needed to get permits, codes of conduct, knowledge gap statements, so we could really make the most of the time we had at sea. So now on board ship, it's probably the shortest phase, but actually is the most iconic, and it's what people think that you do all the time if you ever go into the field, forgetting about all of that in really important planning, and of course all of the hard work that goes on afterwards. But I know I'm already talking to an audience that knows that, so I'm going to move on and tell you just about two pieces of the equipment. I'm not going to go through everything because we had lots of different things on board, but I'm just going to touch a little bit on the multi-beam and video surveys. And this is an image that was put together by my PhD student, Denise Swanborn, and thanks to her for creating this really awesome image of the island of Desroches, and then the chart that we created to allow us to get very close to the shoreline and to allow us to survey some very steep cliffs. So as you can see here, the red colors where I've got my cursor about 10 meters all the way down to the bottom here, which is about 500. And in the middle, just right on this line, is where we see historic coastlines from the last glacial maxima at about 80 to about 120 meters. So using these charts on the bridge, I helped the captain get the ship in very close so that we could deploy our gear right down this wall. And what gear was it and what ship it is, right? Okay, so on the left-hand side, we see the Ocean Zephyr. She was from the commercial fleet, so we had to fit her out for science. So all the containers you see there, the satellite dome, there's a winch back over here, all of these extra antennae, we had to do that in the mobilization. I'm also just going to talk to you about the submersible, but indeed we visualized the seabed from 5 to 500 meters. All systems were stereo systems, and that allowed us to quantify space and fish biomass. And over on this side, these arrows you can see are the stereo systems pointing down, across and out to the side. We've also got up here at the top a high resolution camera, and then lots of lights out on the arms. Hopefully you'll see my cursor as I'm doing that. Submersibles, although very expensive pieces of equipment, were used on this particular expedition for a few reasons. They're very good on steep topography. They also provide a good opportunity to produce really powerful memories for people who are going into the submersible. And this was really important for our Seychelles participants being able to experience their own deep sea. And with communications, the images of people connecting with their ocean is again a very powerful motivator for media. And I'll tell you about our media contribution later. But I did want to put this picture in. This is one I took from the other submersible, but actually looking out to the ship. And it's very rare you get to have a picture from inside a fishbowl. And this is my picture from inside my fishbowl. Now we're going to hear from Steph. We introduced you to Steph at the beginning, but on International Women's Day in 2019, Steph became the very first Seychelles aquanaut. So let's hear from her about that experience.
I'm going in the sub in about 15 to 20 minutes. So I want to say Happy Women's Day to everybody.
When I went down the first time, I was scared. I didn't know what to expect. It was at 250, so you can imagine it was pitch dark down there. The corals were so tiny, and like you can imagine the currents also. My research project is about the variability in the trophic signatures and the food web dynamics within the Seychelles waters. At 100 or 150, you could see like fans, sea fans, fish, tuna, trevally going around like small fishes.
There were Steph's experiences. I'm going to show you, as I promised, a little bit about the waters, because it would be a shame not to show you anything that we saw. But of course, these are just initial impressions. And Paris Stepanoulis, who is the postdoc who's working on this project, has done a huge amount of work leading community analysis and assessing the functional ecology. And we believe it's the first time the functional ecology of deep reefs has ever been assessed in this way. So it is a really important story, but I don't want to take any of his limelight because he's done a really amazing job. So I encourage you to get in contact with him afterwards if you're at all interested. So here we are here in the shallows. What I want you to notice here in Asto, where we are up at 10 meters, is the huge diversity of hard corals and their coverage, which is massively extensive. But do also notice that we do have a few fish species, but not massive abundances and not massive sizes. And I think that was really important for us to understand, because when we went to Aldabra, which was a very nearby island, it had been afforded protection, but had gone through bleaching. So we weren't seeing the coral coverage that we were here in Asto, but indeed the fish communities were much more extensive. So that was a really good indicator of the protection that had been afforded in Aldabra and the importance of that. We're now going to move to, here we go, to 60 meters. Here we can see the most amazing fans. These are Anella fans, part of the Supergorgia. They're about 2 meters by 2 meters to give you some idea of space. We can, however, see, so sorry, that was my phone. We can see lots of photic corals. And we were able to see some corals and even some algae down to about 90 meters, again, reflective of the clear waters that we were exploring. And then as we move down through 120, we're now seeing black corals, close these fans. We're seeing octocoral whip sponges in massive gardens. And then in other areas, as the submersible here goes along the rocks, we can see a lot of overhangs. We can see the amazing 3D structures. And of course, we're not very far away from where the coelacanths are often seen in Comores. So these are some of those similar types of habitats. And then finally into the deep sea. And here we're really seeing our basket stars, our mobile invertebrates. All these little white marks, these are in fact solitary corals, so they're a deep sea species. And then in some of our other rocky outcrops, we're having soft coral fans and urchins, and of course pencil urchins as well. But we did see a lot of these areas that are quite scoured by currents. So this was maybe indicative that there is an upwelling in Asto, and that might be the cause of some of the protection afforded to some of the coral up in the shallows. So a particular interest. Okay. So I think now Sheena is going to quickly explain her first impressions.
I think one of the highlights was to see the change. You know, as you go from zero, there's a lot of light on the corals. And as you go further down to 300 meters, the light dissipates. It seems like life itself slows down as you go further down into the sea.
I love that, life slowing down. And it did really feel like that. It felt amazingly calming. And those of us who are lucky enough to get under the water in our scuba digger gear, we can feel that as well. Ooh, I'm just going to click through these because they seem to be replicates. Apologies. Okay. And I did promise a little bit more on communications, where you can see me here talking to a big fairy microphone and a screen. And this is because we had global coverage. Associated Press were on board the entire expedition, and we also had Sky News on board who were reporting live for a week. And that's fine, and that's global representation, but also each of those organizations were sharing their information with local channels in Seychelles, so that Seychellois could access those images beforehand. And this is really important because often we get the most amazing information about our planet, but they're on pay-per-view channels. And we really wanted to make sure that that wasn't the case. In this particular case, in the video, I was actually talking to school kids from across the globe, and indeed in Seychelles with partners. We spoke with about 600,000 students live to classrooms through the program Submarine STEM. So now to, I guess, the most important piece really, it's creating a legacy, because if we don't do that, then what's the point of us going? And I'll sort of divide this into 3 sections. And the first is the taxonomic workshop and the training workshops. These taxonomic workshop was conducted at SIAB in South Africa with 28 people and 6 experts in person from across the region. The taxonomic workshop was actually 2 weeks. The first week was just for the experts. And then in the second week, we had additional participants from Seychelles, Comores, and South Africa who were there to learn from the experts. And we also brought in 5 additional remote lecturers who could talk to the team about their own expertise. We were able to look at about just over 600 samples from Seychelles and about 40 from Comores across multiple taxa. So really productive. We also, after that, underwent skills training workshops. Here you can see me in a classroom, but in fact, a lot of it was done out in the field, and we see Paris with a calibration cube there, which is vital to calibrate stereo video systems. And in fact, after that picture was taken, they headed into the pool to do that calibration. The samples that were collected, not all of them were taken to those taxonomic workshops. Many of them stayed in Seychelles at the coral collection facility. And those that didn't stay there, I'll explain where they're headed later in the process. So now thinking about data analysis and how we're communicating that, I want to show you another picture of Sheena and introduce you this time to another wonderful woman who's Jennifer Appo. And Jennifer is now doing further studies. But Sheena and Jennifer came to visit us in Oxford through an Africa Oxford Institute fellowship to network and to work on their projects, which was looking at egg larvae for Sheena, and Jennifer was looking at predator abundance around Aldabra. And this is really important to support the long-term development of all of the people who've been involved, and to make sure that together we're creating knowledge that is flexible and usable. Sheena and I have spent a long time talking to government, talking to ministries and agencies, and indeed, in the example that I'm showing you today, this was to Nairobi Convention. So we can see in front of us a minister, principal secretary, and also the coordinator of the Nairobi Convention, sharing with them what we found, but also critically listening to them to understand what their needs are. And of course, these keep changing. And Sheena and I have co-disseminated our work together. And in fact, this picture was taken at Marlborough House, which is the headquarters of the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. But we've also been present at Nairobi Convention Science to Policy meetings as well. And we can talk to users, but we also need to make sure that that wealth of information from the shallows is not siloed with against our knowledge about the deep sea. So together with SACAT, we conducted a symposium. It was meant to be in person, but it ended up being online at the end of 2020. And this was really bringing everyone together who had been apart, but also listening to all of the other amazing marine science that had been conducted. And of course, there was conversations going on by various members of the team across international events, and of course those in the region as well. And Paris has done a lot of work looking at imagery and how best to analyze that in the Western Indian Ocean region. Now, I put this slide in as an example of one of the slides that we had up on a call. Seychelles is it's a large ocean state, but it's got a very small population. And this means that everyone's super busy and they very rarely have the privilege of having a few hours that are interrupted for them to read papers. So we had to come up with inventive ways to ensure that they were really invested co-authors in this case, it was a publication, but all of the knowledge products that were associated with this project. So as you can see here, we really thought about multiple different ways. And it'd be great to hear from all of you and your experiences, if there are any other ways of getting people really involved. But this went all the way from being able to use the anonymous platforms such as Slido through to having personal calls and anonymous notes through Google Forms and the like. And then finally into the stages of kind of where we're at now, the publications and the outputs, and where does this really lead us? So information is currently being curated and will be uploaded into systems. Remember, I said that a lot of the samples actually had come out of Seychelles. And this is because there isn't a museum or any opportunity to create these specimens in country, which is a preference. So Western Australia Museum has agreed to have specimens on long-term loan so that when Seychelles has got the knowledge and they want the specimens back, indeed this is going to be possible. And this long-term loan is still taking a little bit of negotiations through agreements, but it's really important to make sure that Seychelles keeps the autonomy of their own samples and data. A few of the knowledge products that have come out so far is a field ID guide, so we don't lose the information that, that has been created. And then finally, and I guess the reason why I'm talking to you today is this paper that we produced last year in Biology Letters, which really explains a little bit more about the process. And I'm now just going to share a few of the reflections in the last 5 minutes that I've got available so that I can leave you with a few key messages and my key learnings. So this project, as I said, really was a co-produced piece of work through co-development and through co-dissemination. And I think of it as an extension of the scientific method. We always think about that as a circular process. Well, this one, we're involving our colleagues from multiple different disciplines, from outside of academia as well, really needs to sit within that, with legacy being at the heart. We had specific learnings, and many of them actually were unexpected. With this model, we had a decrease in time. We had to change locations because of weather, and I could directly contact the Bureau of Standards and colleagues in Seychelles to say, hey, is it okay if we make these changes? Can we just all get on a call together? So those personal relationships were super valuable. We've also together been able to create some more information about engagement with international parties. And I just wanted to read you a really powerful statement by Pierre Salin, who you've already heard from today, and the Director General of the Ministry of the Environment, Marie-May Muzagali. And they said that understanding the collaborative process was a valuable legacy for Seychelles. This expedition and associated activities provided an indication of how programs can be run and where opportunities might be available for Seychellois scientists who are interested in ocean science. Following this work, standards for engagement have now been established by the ministry. And for me, that's a really powerful message to make sure that we're all playing that game to ensure that we're really listening to each other. Having these open communications meant that we had really clear expectations, and that meant that we also were able to co-design templates for future work together with Seychelles. And finally, we always think we need to communicate better, but actually that was really evident in this conversation. I've spoken about high level, medium level, and then talking to people on the ground, but not necessarily everybody's talking between those layers. So really starting those conversations by checking in and making no assumptions was a really good lesson, and of course, valuable practice in oral communications. So what will we do in the future? Well, more peer-to-peer learning. As expertise build in the region, there'll be a focus on the ship so that peer-to-peer learning can happen there as well as in the taxonomic workshops. And then finally, there's going to be a technology transfer. So we'll be combining some of the high-cost technologies with low-cost high-tech, making sure that there is long-term support for legacy of science so that more nations can do deep sea science in their own waters autonomously. So take-home messages, co-production wasn't only the right process ethically, but it was also achieved much better and more outputs and critically outcomes. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm really happy to share any next steps with you if you're interested. There's lots of projects going on from this. And I would also encourage you to reach out. Let me know if there's any of these aspects I can connect you with my Seychelles colleagues and those from across the region. They haven't been able to be here in person because of the time zones, but they are awesome people, and I'd love to connect you, building those networks across the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for a really engaging and super interesting talk. And also for opening the door to engaging directly with some of your friends and colleagues, as well as yourself more deeply, I suppose. So the floor is now open for questions, and maybe I'll get things started since I don't see anyone with a question in the chat. So actually you touched on it very briefly at the end to, say there are lots of projects that are ongoing. So it was actually one of the things that I was reflecting on. There's so much that has gone on in terms of investments, financially, in terms of human resources, and lots of folks really excited and interested about what you've developed. And so I was just wondering, whether you plan to stay in the area and then continue to sort of revisit some of the sites and continue to do some monitoring, and maybe just an anecdote in terms of what some of the students who have been engaged in this project, what they see as next steps for themselves. Do they want to stay in the Seychelles, or are they keen to get some experience elsewhere? Thank you.
Gosh, that's a lot of questions. So let me.
Yeah, I was going to say, feel free, because I see there's now lots of hands up. So feel free to just concisely respond to one of your choice.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, there's a huge amount of interest. I actually see, I love Seychelles. I feel incredibly blessed to have been to work with Seychelles. It's such an amazing group of people, and I would kind of see a success here if I didn't need to work in these waters anymore, because there's that capacity and interest to do work themselves. And in fact, this has just started. This is very exciting. A small crowd-funded project led by Sheena has just got funded. So she will now be able to do her own work, working with the Seychelles Fisheries Authority to explore those deeper depths. And so that's just one aspect. We've got multiple more working across the Western Indian Ocean region with practitioners to come up with recommendations for how we can include deep reef communities in better management systems of those waters. So there's just a few answers. Yes, of course, I'll always stay. Oh my goodness. I mean, it's so fantastic. But in fact, our next expedition, which should have been March, which just postponed again, will be in Maldives. So we've been working in a similar manner with our colleagues in Maldives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I think, Amanda, you were next with your hands raised, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, but I'd rather defer to the students. So I'm going to defer to Roshni, who's from Mauritius, which is just next door. And I'd rather hear her question than mine.
Okay, well, let's defer to Roshni. I've asked you to unmute, and then we'll go over through the folks who have raised their hands.
Hi, Lucy. I really enjoyed your talk. It was really nice to see Seychelles. I worked in Desroches and Mahe as well. And as a manager, I'm from Mauritius. And so I was wondering that I know that Mauritius and Seychelles have a joint management area. And I was wondering if it was a plan or you guys had a chance to explore that part, because I personally haven't heard a lot about deep sea science in Mauritius either. And if that was of interest, or if that was part of the project, yeah, I'd love to know more.
So awesome to meet you. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, so there is a joint management area, which is actually super interesting when we think about how we look at governance of the ocean. But yeah, that's another story, I think. But directly to answer your question, we didn't go into the joint management area. I know there's been a few expeditions that have looked at the surface. I know they particularly looked at cetaceans. And there is a planned expedition by Monaco Explorations, which again has been delayed, but I think should be going out later this year, which will look at that area. And really hoping to support the Monaco expeditions with some deep work. And Sheena's definitely been in a lot of contact with them, and so has Steph, and their work through their agencies in Seychelles. For us, really, it's about where we can get funding. And unfortunately, it's just a state right now that that's a challenge. We do hope that we'll be able to get into that joint management area and hopefully Mascarene Plateau. So I'd love to stay in contact with you, because in fact, that connection between Seychelles and Mauritius is super important. So super lovely to meet you today, and hopefully we can do so in person at some point.
Thank you, Lucy. Nice to meet you too.
Madam, I'm happy to pass it back on to you, otherwise go to Rashid next. Okay.
Well, I think we'll keep it in the African continent. I'll give it to Rashid.
Okay. Perfect, thank you. Go ahead, Rashid.
Yeah, I knew that Amanda will let me go, right? So this is good. Actually, I don't have a question, it's a comment. I just wanted to say thank you for showing us a new way of doing science, co-creating science. And I also wanted to commend you for the support you are giving to young African women. I think that would be one of your biggest legacy. Just doing that, you just see the one whom you managed to get into the deep sea at first. She said, I was scared at first, and you managed to do that. I think this is really fantastic. Thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you for such a lovely comment. And yeah, I mean, it is really at the heart of my research. And in fact, all of our Seychelles participants went in the submersibles multiple times, and really got to have that experience, not just experiencing the marine waters, but really directing the information, directing the submersible pilots of where they wanted to go. And that autonomy was amazing. And yeah, it's always my privilege because I learned so much from them. So amazing. Thank you, Rashid.
That's really wonderful. Maybe to keep it in the African continent, we'll go to Brian next.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Lucy. That was a really inspiring talk, actually. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to come back to a point that you raised in the beginning about the lack of access to infrastructure to do deep sea research. And there's so many countries that have this problem. So I wanted to ask you, based on your experience, what are your thoughts on how to enable that for other countries?
Yeah, oh gosh, I didn't prime you, Brian, but I'm loving that you asked me that question, because that was one of the things. I was like, oh no, you know, I haven't had time to talk about it because there's so many other things. So in fact, that is a project that Sheena and I are really working on now. There are a lot of low-cost, high-tech technologies out there, and more that are being developed by amazing, innovative engineers all the time. So what we're doing now is combining those different types of technologies together. And if anyone's particularly interested in some of those ideas, then do let me know. You know, very happy to share the list that I'm collating with Sheena, and we're doing that right now for a project that we're trying to start. I think one aspect is really showing that it's possible, because there's lots of equipment we can put off very small boats. And also there's opportunities of us being able to work with industry and with fishers. And we've done that, relatively successfully around Seychelles. And indeed, I've also been able to do some of that work with colleagues in South Africa in our work in Comores, which I haven't spoken about here, but had sort of very similar aims. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities. There is lots of equipment, and we can visualize the deep sea for about $200. Okay, so we are talking about relatively low cost. It's not super cheap, absolutely it's not, but it's very different to tens of thousands of dollars, which is what it would have been even 10 years ago. And the programs that we're developing now are really looking at that innovative steps. What can we do today, which is cool, but what can we do in 5 years' time if we can work together as a really cohesive group? So hopefully that answered your question, Brian, but really happy to be in touch more if that's of interest.
Yeah, no, that was great.
Thank you. Andrea, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Colette. Thank you, Lucy, for the talk. It was wonderful to hear about. I've got 2 questions, but I'll try to keep it short because of time and there are other askers. One, I'm curious about just the challenges of co-creation. I spend a lot of time engaged in similar methods of research and regularly come up against the challenge of grants seeking, one principal investigator or conferences only accepting one speaker, and these barriers are endless. Just any strategies that you and your partners have taken to overcome some of those? And then my second part is more of a curiosity. I'm just wondering about decolonization as a narrative within Seychelles. Is that an active and ongoing conversation, and is it also part of scholarship in that space? I'm aware of decolonization being so active on the African continent in the scholarship space, but wondering if that's the same in Seychelles. Thank you.
Okay, gosh. So challenges, yes, I agree, really challenging. Now, I think the advantage that I had with this project is that just putting my Oxford hat on, I would not have been able to do this piece of work. I can only do it because of the close collaboration with Necton, which was able to fund this work through our partners, which is Kensington Tools and Omega, and the multiple industry partners that provided in-kind support. So that was really important. So we didn't have to have a principal investigator. Yes, I know I was coordinating the science, but there was multiple different people leading. So then we could have all of the different projects that could take equal footing when we were at sea, which included those of our Seychelles participants, as well as our overarching questions. Well, I mean, I don't like to talk for Seychelles because I am not Seychellois, and I, have only spent a few years there. However, Seychelles is a relatively young nation in comparison with elsewhere, and there wasn't an historic legacy of a population. So that colonization was actually the first inhabitants to those islands. So that has happened multiple times. So there is a narrative around where those people have come from, but it's a slightly different narrative to the conversations maybe that are going on in the mainland. But as I said, I don't wish to talk for Seychelles or Seychellois.
Thank you. And then we'll pass on to Alexandra quickly before having Amanda then wrap up. Thank you so much.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. So I just wanted to thank you for the work you've done and just echo some of the others. It's really great to see this work being done elsewhere in the world. I'm an expedition coordinator and marine scientist from Canada, and we've done similar work here. And I was really interested the point you made about bringing decision makers. And I was wondering a little bit more to being the conversation, even expectations you have with some of those makers, and what the expectation coming out of, like, is the boundaries for the existing protected areas and so forth. So just what that process was like of bringing her on board, and what the outcome of that is just experiential. Thanks.
gosh, Colette, could you relate that? Because Alexandra was breaking up a little bit for me.
Yeah, I think it was the same on my end. Alexandra, I think you were saying something about engagement around policymakers. But otherwise, maybe since we didn't quite get your question, it might be a question for you to follow up with Lucy, if you don't mind, directly via email, or so that you can get an answer. Just because we're also running out of time otherwise. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. I just turned off my my Wi-Fi, so hopefully my cellular works a bit better. Can you hear me better now?
Much better.
Okay, okay. Apologies for that. No, so I was just curious, your process of bringing a decision maker on board, and if there were any conversations leading into those people joining, you know, as far as any expectations for marine management or any like changes to boundaries or protection levels for some of the sites. And certainly with the biodiversity discoveries that you found, some of the giant corals, for example. So in bringing on those decision makers, was it purely just experiential for them, or was there some sort of expectation of management as a result of that?
Sure. So you met Alain during the presentation, but the one massive decision maker that you didn't meet was the president of Seychelles. He actually joined us on expedition for 2 days and gave the first live presidential address from submersible. So of course there's a little bit of PR and whatever behind it, but it provided this narrative of this longer commitment. And in fact, since that expedition, not just because of it, but because of multiple different things, Seychelles now has committed to protect the entirety of their coastline, which is huge. So it wasn't, you know, I absolutely won't claim that it was from this expedition, but it's part of this evolving narrative about understanding the ocean and really experiencing that. And I think having Alain with us on board, and he was with us for just over a week, he could experience it, but we could also have other conversations with me and him, but also conversations between all of the Seychelles scientists, really saying, I wasn't expecting that. And then that helped the dialogue for what was to move forward into the management plans. So the designated boundaries were there with a very rigorous process led by ministry and supported by TNC. But I think it does talk to that sort of wider ambition and the ambition to be successful and to get it done.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
So Colette, shall I launch in now then? Okay.
Yes, go ahead, please. Thanks.
So Lucy, I'm going to stick my neck out on behalf of the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries and ask you to convey an invitation to your Seychelles colleagues to come and talk to us in, I don't know, a year or 2 years, whenever is appropriate for them, about how this knowledge has been deployed in their planning, their action, their implementation. You talked about the translation of science into policy. And I think everybody on this call cares deeply about how knowledge is actually applied to improve the status of our oceans and the people who depend on them. So I think it would be gripping, and if you wanted to come along, we could only welcome that, but it'd be gripping to hear from the Seychelles how this knowledge generation has actually played out in the evolving stewardship of their ocean and in their own well-being. And the fact that you had so many gripping questions from so many people tells you the influence that your presentation had. You resonated with a huge number of us, each for our own reason. And I want to thank you very deeply for your willingness to come and share, and of course for the tremendous approach that you've taken, which we would all embrace wholeheartedly. So thank you enormously.